an unforeseen event occurred for the first time in decades. The voice that had reassured millions, Jimmy Swaggart, did not make an appearance on his planned Sunday show. There was stillness, no announcement, no explanation. Across the globe, viewers sat staring at blank screens, perplexed and anxious, as the stage lights remained dark. The only answer people got from the church's incessantly ringing phone lines was a gentle word from staff. "Please remember to pray for Brother Swaggart." A storm of worry was sparked by that one sentence. It seems that the guy who had dedicated his life to advocating for healing and hope was now in need of it himself. Jimmy Swaggart's life had always been a public record, with both successful and difficult times. He had started out preaching in little rural churches, frequently with 10 or fewer people in attendance. However, his message, music, and emotion were potent. He became one of the most well-known televangelists by the 1980s. Every week, millions of people saw him sing, preach, and pray to God with such fervor that even the most heartless people might be moved. He was more than just a preacher to many. He supported them during their worst hours and served as a companion, spiritual father, and lifeline. Behind the scenes, however, things had started to steadily shift. Jimmy's enthusiasm had diminished during the last few months. A couple of the broadcasts he missed, his voice grew weaker and his sermons grew shorter. Among the congregation, there were whispers and rumors. He was said to be ill. Some thought he was simply exhausted. However, no one was certain. During services, Frances Swaggart, his lifelong friend, was observed praying more frequently. Her eyes, which had once been strong, now held a mute fear. Her silent tears screamed more than words, but she never mentioned what was going on. The day finally arrived when everything became painfully obvious. A brief message was given by the Swaggart family. "Brother Jimmy is presently in critical care due to complications resulting from a severe medical condition. At this crucial moment, we are requesting your prayers." Only a plea for prayers was made. No other information or reference to the sickness was made. The news was devastating. Candles were lit in churches across America. People from all around the world started sharing stories about how Jimmy Swaggart had improved their lives, and social media was inundated with posts that read, "Praying for Jimmy." Jimmy Swaggart remained motionless in his hospital room in Baton Rouge, hooked up to devices that beeped regularly next to him. Frances sat silently next to him, holding his hand as his Bible rested unopened on the side table. She would not be separated from him. She would be found by nurses touching his hand, whispering prayers, and occasionally simply sitting quietly. The doctors did not know what was going to happen next. Recovery from such difficulties was uncommon at his age. They all agreed, however, that his heart remained strong. He wasn't prepared to give up. As the days went by, an extraordinary event occurred. Something changed in the quiet of that hospital room. Doctors later interpreted Jimmy's unconscious but steady breathing as a moment of deep subconscious activity. But it was much more for Frances and the believers. Jimmy had a vision while he was in that state. Walking through an ancient country church, where he had delivered his first sermon, he saw himself, the choir singing one of his favorite hymns, the wooden pews, and the sunlight coming through dusty windows. He then saw the faces of persons he had previously assisted in healing and consoling. A few gave him smiles, others merely uttered the words, "Thank you." A voice then reverberated throughout the deserted chapel. "Your work isn't finished yet." His condition started to improve in a matter of hours. A little better. For a moment, he opened his eyes. His fingers moved. Frances knew the prayers were effective, but the doctors were perplexed. Jimmy grew stronger every day. The family thanked everyone in a heartfelt video. "We have hope because of your prayers. We're witnessing a progress miracle." Millions of people saw that video. People wept while they watched it. His complete recovery was now prayed for by churches that had quit supporting him years ago. Then came the day that no one had anticipated so quickly. On a live video, Jimmy Swaggart was seen lying on his hospital bed. He spoke steadily but weakly. Though exhausted, his eyes were vibrant. That little communication spread like wildfire around the world. He said, "I'm here because of grace and because of you. I felt every prayer. I saw your faces. I've heard your voices." Over the next few weeks, Jimmy started to regain his strength, but something inside him changed. Instead of rushing back to large stages or lengthy sermons, he was concentrating on smaller gatherings. It became more than just a medical recovery. It became a spiritual moment, a reminder that even those in leadership need to be lifted up. His sermons became softer, deeper, more personal. He cried more, smiled more, and than ever before. He told his story honestly. He spoke about facing death. He talked about hearing God's voice. He talked about the power of collective faith. He told people not to take life or purpose. Jimmy Swaggart was still alive and preaching, but his new purpose was to remind the world that faith can shine through even the darkest valley, and that sometimes God allows us to fall not to end our story, but to rewrite it in a more powerful way. Ultimately, the silence that had once terrified millions of people became a powerful testimony. Jimmy Swaggart's journey didn't start on a stage or in a crowded church with lights and cores. Rather, it started on dusty roads in small towns with just a borrowed Bible and a strong desire to preach. Growing up in Louisiana, he saw his family struggle financially, but even in those difficult times, he immediately discovered his calling. His first sermons were given in churches, in fields beside rivers, and occasionally just outside of people's homes where small groups gathered to listen. He had no professional sound system, no trained choir, no proper pulpit, just a deep, powerful voice, a simple guitar, and a message that moved people. He wasn't drawn to fame or fortune, but to faith. There were days when he went hungry, nights when he cried in prayer, and mornings when he got up again to preach. Sometimes he slept in his car, and other times he traveled on foot or in old used cars that barely made it through the long highways of the American South. The fire in Jimmy's soul was what made him unique. His preaching was more than just words, it was life. He wept as he spoke, shouted with delight, and frequently broke into song in the middle of his sermons. People came to feel the Spirit, not to hear a man, and his name gradually spread, first from town to town and then from state to state. By the time television became a common household fixture, Jimmy had already established himself in hundreds of churches. Church leaders started asking him to speak, and his music, particularly the way he played the piano and sang gospel hymns, touched people in ways that few could explain. His songs were more than just melodies, they were rhythmic prayers. A new avenue, however, opened up. A local television station offered to tape one of his sermons, and when it was broadcast on a Sunday morning, the response was astounding. Letters flooded in, viewers called the station to inquire about his return date, and people from states far beyond Louisiana wanted to hear more. That one broadcast became a weekly show, and that weekly show became a worldwide ministry. Jimmy Swaggart was more than just a preacher in the 1980s. He was a movement, and his broadcasts were translated into many languages, drawing millions of viewers from nations he had never been to. Families would huddle around their televisions as if it were church. The ministry grew quickly, large buildings were built, a Bible college was launched, and thousands of staff worked behind the scenes to keep things going. He had a way of making people feel seen, forgiven, and loved, regardless of what their past held. Even people who didn't consider themselves religious felt something when they heard him speak. However, Jimmy remained at the center of it all. He remained committed to his goal of winning lost souls to the Lord in spite of the increasing media attention and his burdensome responsibilities, always saying, "If I can reach just one more, it's worth it." Frances, his wife and ministry partner, stood firmly beside him and was more than just the preacher's wife. Over the years, Jimmy Swaggart's voice became a sound of solace to many. She was his shield, handling administration, praying over staff, and frequently speaking at women's events with grace and wisdom. Their bond was unbreakable, and they weathered storms, both spiritual and worldly, together, never letting the spotlight change their core beliefs. His rise wasn't about buildings or television ratings. He wasn't just a preacher on a screen. He was a friend in their living room, a counselor in their time of pain, and a guide when faith felt far away. His sermons influenced generations, and his songs were sung in homes, churches, and revivals around the world. Even people who had never met him felt as though they knew him. Jimmy Swaggart's journey from the dusty roads of Louisiana to the bright lights of global ministry reminded the world that faith, when pure and passionate, can truly move mountains. It was about lost people finding light, broken hearts being healed, and one man who refused to give up even when everything around him seemed small. Jimmy Swaggart stood like a rock for many years, unequivocal, dependable, and passionate. His music continued to move people to tears, and his sermons were full of energy. But as time passed quietly, little changes started to show. At first, only those closest to the ministry, his employees, his family, and his devoted followers noticed. Little things first. Jimmy, who used to be known for showing up early for church, started showing up just minutes before the service started. He occasionally appeared worn out, his eyes less bright than before, and his preaching style softer, not with faith, but with force. The man who used to pace the stage with a voice like thunder now spent more time sitting behind the pulpit, delivering his messages with composure rather than ferocity. He began canceling outside events, politely declining invitations from other ministries that he had once accepted with joy, and some weeks services were shortened or special guests asked to fill in. The congregation noticed, but no one wanted to acknowledge that something was amiss. People thought it was age, and in a way they were right. What could possibly be wrong with Brother Swaggart? After all, Francis Swaggart, on the other hand, was the first to see the truth, seeing it in private when he held his chest during lengthy meetings, when he whispered prayers in the middle of the night, when he struggled to fall asleep, and when she watched the strong man she had known for decades slowly slow down, not because he wanted to, but because his body was begging for rest. Staff members also noticed subtle warning signs. Jimmy's voice cracked more frequently during worship. Once, during a live service, he paused mid-sentence, closed his eyes for a few seconds, and then continued as if nothing had happened. He occasionally forgot the names of people he had worked with for years. Viewers were unaware of what was going on, but within the ministry, concerns started to surface. Despite this, Jimmy never voiced his displeasure or alerted the public because he felt that his calling outweighed his weaknesses. In a private meeting, he once declared, "As long as I have breath, I will preach. I'll sit if I'm unable to walk. I'll talk even if I can't sing, but I won't stop." But he had a gut feeling that something wasn't quite right. Once leading healing crusades over the globe, the man now found it difficult to cross the church hallway on his own. Pity was not what he wanted. He was not looking for attention. All he wanted was to serve. During services, Frances started to remain nearer. She now sat next to him more frequently during broadcasts, but she was usually behind the scenes. As she held the microphone, viewers saw that her hands trembled a little. She would look at Jimmy worriedly, particularly when he paused for breath or coughed in between sentences. Additionally, Jimmy occasionally needed assistance getting back up after inviting people to come forward during altar calls. These weren't only aging symptoms. These were indications of something concealed, something subtly accumulating within his body. Nevertheless, Junie continued to go forward. Sunday after Sunday, he gave it his all. However, his strength had changed. The gasoline was running low, but the fire was still there. And those who cared for him the most started preparing their hearts for an unpleasant reality. Jimmy never missed the final sign, which was displayed during a significant yearly service. That year, he stood at the pulpit, gazed out at the audience, and remained silent for a while. His voice did not follow the movement of his lips. Frances moved forward and put her hand on his shoulder, while softly murmuring something. Jimmy flashed a feeble smile, nodded, and left the stage. The ministry was chilled by the moment. People wept. Some felt that something significant had started, so they prayed immediately. However, no formal announcement was made. The show aired replays throughout the next few days. No statement was issued by the ministry. "Brother Swaggart is resting," the staff said politely to callers as the phones continued to ring. It was the start of a quiet that would break the hearts of millions of people. Please remember him in your prayers. Something unexpected occurred right when it seemed like everyone was holding their breath and waiting for the worst. It began with a movement that was initially hardly perceptible. Jimmy Swaggart's fingers twitched a little, and he shifted his head on the pillow quietly. The medical professionals who had been closely monitoring his condition arched their brows. Although they had previously witnessed patients deteriorate in this condition, they had hardly ever witnessed them resist in such a manner. When it occurred, Frances Swaggart was present. As she sat quietly next to his hospital bed with her hands clasped together in prayer, she felt his fingers suddenly encircle hers. She let out a weak but deliberate breath, tears forming in her eyes. It was not a reflex. He was the one. Jimmy was answering. Nurses came running in. The machines beeped more quickly. Doctors checked his vitals, rechecked charts, and spoke in hushed tones. Jimmy's breathing somewhat improved in a matter of hours. His oxygen saturation level leveled off. He was still weak, but there were traces of movement in his body. Nobody was able to provide a detailed medical explanation. They could only respond, "There's improvement." However, There was no need for an explanation for those who believed in miracles. She was crying so hard that her eyes swelled. Her voice seemed hopeful this time, though, whispering, "I just wanted to say thank you to everyone praying for Jimmy." She did. "We're making headway. It's there, but it moves slowly. Please continue to pray." On social media, that 1-minute video became viral. It was viewed and shared by millions. Around the world, pastors prayed for Jimmy Swaggart before starting their sermons. The world was praying for the voice that had prayed for others. The atmosphere inside the hospital started to shift. There was now a calm energy in the once somber space. Soft evangelical music was played on a tiny speaker that the nurses brought in. A few of Jimmy's classic tunes. He heard his own voice singing, and even in his semi-conscious state, a few tears fell down his cheek. Just the mention of your name, Jesus. Even when his body was unable to talk, it seemed as though his spirit remembered. He opened his eyes more frequently day by day, gradually, for seconds at first, then minutes. Jimmy gave her a direct look one morning, while Francis drew closer and mouthed the word, "Pray." She took his and her hands, trembling, and started to pray aloud. Physicians walked in and silently observed the scene. A man who was long believed to be dying is suddenly reviving himself through whispering. Then the world's long-awaited moment arrived. Jimmy Swaggart, lying in bed with machinery all around him, gestured to the nurse as if he wanted to talk. He nearly lost his voice, but with perseverance, and Francis holding the microphone close, he was able to speak 3 simple words: "God is good." The ministry released the tape online with permission, and it was broadcast on the official page of his church. It received over 30 million views in a matter of hours. It moved people of many backgrounds, including Christians, atheists, detractors, and supporters. Seeing a man of such spiritual strength lie in frailty and yet choose faith over fear has a profoundly human quality. Encouragement poured in. The hospital received tributes, drawings, movies, music, and letters from all over the world. To store all of the gifts, the crew had to set up a dedicated area. He received some messages from strangers. Others belonged to people who had abandoned their faith years before but had come back after hearing his message. Physicians acknowledged what many people already thought. There was more to this than science. Jimmy had taken an unexpected turn. Although they predicted that his recuperation would still be drawn out and gradual, it was now feasible. Back at the ministry, they started getting ready for the celebration of a miracle, not for a comeback to the stage quite yet. For a special prayer night, his church's members came together. This time, it was Thanksgiving, not the morning. They lighted candles that represented the word hope, sung his songs, and told their tales. After weeks of uncertainty, silence, and prayers, the moment that no one dared to imagine finally arrived, and Jimmy Swaggart, still weak and recovering, asked for something simple. And in that hospital room, surrounded by love, light, and the power of prayer, Jimmy Swaggart closed his eyes, not in sickness but in peace, and whispered to Francis, "He's not done with me yet. It's just a phone with a camera, not a pulpit or stage." Francis gave him a startled but moved glance. One peaceful hour at a time, she had watched him gradually regain his power. From lying motionless to sitting up with assistance, he had changed from being silent to whispering. He was now prepared to address the world that had joined him in prayer, rather than a group of people in front of him. In his hospital room, the staff assists with setting up a simple recording setup. Just Jimmy on a hospital bed with a blanket over his legs, a small wooden cross on the table next to him, and Francis holding his hand tenderly. No elaborate lighting, no church background. Timmy stared straight into the camera as it switched on. His once dominant and thunderous voice had become cracked and meek, yet it was still full of emotion. He gave everyone a small smile and added, "I want you to know, I could feel every single prayer." He spoke slowly, yet each word was significant. His expression conveyed both the anguish he had experienced and the tranquility he had discovered in the valley. He went on, "I never felt alone, even though there were times when I wasn't sure I would survive." Francis wiped a tear from his face as he stopped to gather his breath. "Your prayers carried me, your love reached me, and my Lord never left me." For a moment, Jimmy seemed to be looking down for the perfect words. "I have dedicated my life to preaching to the world," he continued, raising his gaze once more. He took a deep breath before continuing, "And let me tell you this, God's not finished with me yet." That line was powerful, not because of its volume, but because of its force. That these past few weeks I've been the one listening to God, listening to silence, listening to my own heart. The video, which was shared on all major platforms and placed on Jimmy's official church page, concluded with him quietly saying, "I love you all. Thank you for standing with me. We'll meet again soon in church or in prayer." Views soared within minutes. Tears filled my eyes as I read the remarks on social media. Our supplications were heard. Brother Jimmy, welcome back. People were brought to quiet, even those who had not followed his ministry for years. Churches played his message throughout their own services in villages, cities, and even foreign nations. Some arranged Thanksgiving prayer nights. Others gave first-hand accounts of how their own faith was rekindled by his recovery. Families who had loved ones battling similar struggles to his played his video for them in hospitals. Inmates found hope in his struggle when they heard him speak in prisons. His voice, which had been muffled by illness, had suddenly come back with the soft, broken strength of a man who had survived the fire rather than the roar of earlier. To maintain the link rather than bring him back to the stage just yet, the ministry team started working on new updates. The world was given access to weekly meditations, brief notes from his bedside, Francis's piano music, and Jimmy's brief devotionals. Performance was no longer the main focus. It has to do with being there. Jimmy emphasized one straightforward fact to everyone throughout this entire ordeal. Sometimes surviving the valley and deciding to speak again produces the most impactful sermons, not standing behind a pulpit. The Jimmy Swaggart the world had known for decades was not the same man who came home from the hospital. His voice was quieter, his hands were weaker, and his body moved more slowly. However, his heart was more profound. There was a permanent alteration within him. It was more than just getting through a sickness. It was about finding something everlasting in the frailty, something sacred in the silence. Jimmy Swaggart had now returned, but this time as a soul who had journeyed with God through the valley of shadows and emerged with light, not as a preacher pursuing platforms. It was also different back at the ministry grounds in Baton Rouge. The employees no longer pushed for larger productions or hurried through schedules. Everything slowed down. A new sense of reverence, serenity, and closer connection prevailed. The studio still had Jimmy's chair, but the intensity around it had softened. The lengthy sermons and theatrical productions had vanished. Rather than reading from a screenplay, Jimmy shared his thoughts in brief observations. He no longer discussed numbers, buildings, or crowds. He talked on the value of just breathing when you get up every morning. He spoke of Francis and how strong she was on the worst of days. He discussed faith, the kind that whispers when no one else is present, not the kind that yells in public. Jimmy stated something that silenced the entire room in one of his first official messages after his return. "I was a passionate preacher once. I preach with pain now, but I've discovered that both can influence others, because God uses your wounds in addition to your voice." Hearing it made people cry because it was more than just words. It was the truth from a man who had taken a risk and decided to return with a mission. Jimmy started to concentrate more on mentoring. He welcomed young church leaders, musicians, and pastors to his house and led them with stories rather than directives. He shared with them his triumphs, his regrets, his failures, and above all, the grace that sustained him during it all. His bond with Francis became much closer. They were frequently spotted holding hands and grinning over memories that only they shared while seated together in peaceful areas of the cathedral. He would occasionally sing gently next to her while she played the piano, not for the audience or performance, but for God. From spectacular to grounded, the ministry changed. They added prayer rooms. Bible study groups expanded in number. People come to heal, not simply to listen. Their narrative had become Jimmy's. A tale about tumbling, shattering, praying, and getting back up. "I used to think the greatest miracle was healing the sick, but now I know the real miracle is getting a second chance at life and choosing to live it differently," Juni remarked, gazing into the camera in one of his final recorded comments of that year. All generations were moved by that message. It was not the last chapter, it was a humble and graceful start to a new chapter. Jimmy was also aware that he might never again stand in stadiums or perform for crowds of thousands of people. He didn't have to, because his survival was now his greatest preaching. His quiet conveyed the most important message, and the heart of everyone who had prayed for him, wept for him, and discovered through his suffering that often the most potent voices are the ones that return softer, slower, but full of the truth of heaven was his greatest platform.